For decades, European biotech has been shaped by some of the strictest regulations in the world. Post-Brexit, the UK had a choice. In a major departure from the EU, England chose to open the door to NGTs. What does that divergence mean for innovation, for trade, and for farmers in both the UK and the EU? We assembled an expert panel to explain the current reality and what could be ahead. From Denmark, Jan Gottlieb, commercial lead and co-founder of Traitomic, part of the Carlsberg Group. From the UK, Nigel Moore, head of food ingredients at KWS Group. And bringing a global perspective from her work across North America, Europe, and Latin America, Katie Davis, who leads global regulatory, government affairs, and compliance at CIBUS. Nigel, as our Brit on the panel, can I throw the first one to you? Can you give us a snapshot of what the UK decided and how critical it was to UK agriculture?
Yes, I think certainly in the whole discussion of new breeding techniques, genome editing, and how that should be regulated, the discussion was happening before the Brexit event. And certainly then the UK government, once outside the European Union, looked at all of the areas of excellence that can happen for the UK. So actually regulating for genome editing became quite a high priority to create that opportunity in an independent market. And so that's led to this slightly faster speed than the European Union.
Can you expand a little on what motivated them?
Well, I really looking at I mean, the UK has a long history of innovation, research excellence, particularly in plant science, crop science. There's a lot of plant breeding in the UK. And so really as part of that debate to bring this forward, give it some priority, really fits with that national strategy.
Katie, can I throw the next one to you? So you've obviously been involved in policy for years and years from a global perspective. Do you see this move by the UK being part of a broader strategy of sort of moving from a regulation focus to an innovation focus?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we zoom out, a number of countries in North and South America have been developing and modernizing their regulations for many years now. And in some cases, we would say, even have mature regulatory systems for gene editing. Great examples, of course, are the United States and Canada, which have led, and been really exciting to see Latin America, which has almost a near harmonized approach. And what's really leading that trend, and Nigel referenced it, is kind of an understanding that these technologies we're talking about, the suite of gene editing tools, is really just innovation in plant breeding. It really is just mutation breeding and tools to enable that. So in that way, the products we're creating are no different from those that can be created through conventional breeding, just taking much far fewer years to bring them to market. So what we're seeing is country after country, and the UK is the latest example of this, that are recognizing that really to support innovation in our country, we need to align with the science and we need to move forward and modernize as well. And the UK is really the next example of that. Yeah.
Jan, you are watching this from inside the EU, so you're going to perhaps be hearing slightly different conversations than maybe Nigel does here in the UK. What are you hearing in terms of how policymakers are maybe responding to this move by the UK? Is it being seen as bold or perhaps risky?
I think it's a good question, and I might not be as close to it by profession as Nigel and Katie, but I do think that I think this has been going on for EU for quite some time. We are talking, 10, 12 years potentially. And I think it will always help regulators that some countries show a way to do it, gives clarity, however clear it is, and gives a format. I'm not to say how much that influenced the regulators' opinions. I think there's also examples of EU having a few lenses more to this than the UK or legislation. But But I do think it helps because it gives concreteness and clarity if you like that or not. But it will help you when you are making compromises that you are not the first or stand alone. And for sure, EU are not the first, but they have run a long process. And hopefully that will give clarity now. And I think it serves as a good example. I don't think one can determine if it's a whip or a carrot, but clarity and things to debate from is always good. And let's not forget that this is still UK. It's not to compare countries, but it is a former EU member and so on and so forth. So it comes with a lot of, might use the right word, grit, that it's based on what UK thinks. And that I think is beneficial. And some might also not be offended, but would say, no, but that's not, but I think it helps with clarity.
I'd like to dig into the ramifications of this divergence between the EU and UK. Maybe I'll go and chat to each of you about this. Broadly, does it have a potential to increase trade barriers almost between the two regions? Or conversely, is there perhaps opportunity that the EU would see this as almost a healthy competition?
Maybe
Nigel,
I go first, and
Yeah.
then I think Katie's got a lot of experience of this as well. But I think when you look at the global position around genome editing, every country is doing its own thing. So there is a patchwork of different regulation. So having something slightly different and we keep saying UK, but we have to remember it is only England rather than UK. And but having that being slightly different to the EU and moving at slightly different speeds is really fitting with that global picture. So yes, there will be some differences across the border, but so there are if we wanted to go to Argentina or somewhere else. So so at this stage of the game where everybody is implementing first regulations, they're sort of bound to be different. That's not ideal, but it's being realistic. That's how the world works.
Absolutely. And what's really exciting about what's happening in the UK is it's enabling companies to use that as a springboard then for the European market. Because when we think about product development using these technologies, there's really three key pieces. And we talk about how precision editing is fast, and it is, but there's pieces that come around that. It starts with gene discovery, being able to edit the how of what you do, and then being able to, of course, validate those traits in the field. And what we've learned is that being able to grow crops in their environment and test them in the environment where they will be commercialized is very important. So we have the opportunity now really to expand that work in the UK, to test varieties in the UK in a way that we haven't in the past. CIBUS, for example, we've been actively testing in the UK under permit now for several years, as are a few other companies. But it's enabled us to have that sort of, as I said, springboard, that platform, that branching off point for development for when the EU is open to be able to quickly introduce new varieties to the market. So that's the opportunity that's there. And then to your question about versus UK versus EU, of course, trade is always a consideration. But I think for sure it's bound to spur thought around, potentially the EU falling behind with the UK being able to move forward. Yeah.
Perfect, Jan.
Yeah, and I think I will also comment that I think it's fantastic with the spearhead. It gives opportunity, but I also think that the seed industry, the trade industry, it is a small world. It is a global trade. Of course, there is already on different elements, not just technology, a patchwork of regulatory, which big or small companies can deal with and tackle. And that can be hindering innovation or launches of traits or crops or varieties. But on the other hand, there is also a need really to democratize these things and lower the barrier. So I think it's a great spearhead. The concern could be if EU cannot find, I think the intent, that's the word Nigel had used also in the conference. I think the intent of the legislation in the UK, which is on the table, and what is being discussed at EU, we don't know the finals, but they're probably the same. And it's not details between them, but that will at some point hopefully be more aligned, because traits will trade and it will follow a global scheme. Otherwise, it will not, the innovation will not come to market. in all respect of UK market and size, but from a breeding perspective, you need to look at it from a European market or a global market or a Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere to make your business cases. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely, and if I can jump in there as well, when we look at the European regulation in the UK, there are a lot of similarities conceptually, and it is based, as Katie said before, it's around being mutation breeding is mutation breeding, and the new methods have the same genetic result as old methods, just more precise. And so when you look at those concepts, you see the same concepts in the UK regulation as you do in the EU. And therefore, when you think about, well, how do trade discussions go in the future, you've actually got a lot of commonality. Both sets of regulations then get entangled with other considerations. In the UK, we're in the middle of developing guidelines for food and feed authorization. They talk about things like toxicity and allergenicity in genome edited crops, which you wouldn't talk about in a conventional. And you go, well, that's crazy. That's not the purpose of the regulation. In the EU, we've got discussions going on around sustainability, and so that basic principle does get entangled with other more political concepts during that regulatory process, which is which is painful. And if that creates barriers, they are harder barriers to overcome, rather than a technical definition of, well, actually, is this an edit that creates something that's sufficiently conventional to not require any extra controls?
An excellent addition. Nigel, let me stay with you just for a moment. Being the lone Brit on the panel, since the UK has been through this process, are there things the EU could learn from the experience in terms of pace, in terms of perhaps less on the policy side as the process side of how this has come together?
Nigel will have lots to say about this.
I could do it, but we have limited time. So, yes and no. I mean, we can learn from each other, actually. I mean, the two things are happening in very different political environments. So they're different. The UK has some very good definitions of equivalence to nature. I think the EU has struggled with that a bit more and come up with, well, a certain number of base pairs. But again, there are all sorts of things we can live with. What becomes potentially difficult are these other political considerations. Can they learn? Can one learn from the other? For sure they can. I mean, every bit of experience of this, and they can also learn from Canada and other countries that have regulated, and who are also struggling with these same sorts of things. So for sure, learn from it. I think we have to just be a little bit careful of saying that sort of one's better than the other, because that reduces the discussion and stifles debate about, well, what actually is the best way. Take the best of both and work on that.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up on that, I think it's where we've seen governments and regulators being open to dialogue with industry. We've seen successful implementation of regulatory guidelines, because one of the things that, and it's different from country to country and everyone has their own needs, but there's differing levels of expertise in government around, especially plant breeding. And so it's been helpful, I think, to have those that direct dialogue, to be able to educate and explain what it is we're doing, why there is such a long history of safety around conventional breeding. And so that would be, I think, one piece of advice, not just to the EU, but to any governments that haven't yet, modernized their regulations around this technology, is really understand how breeding works, to begin with. And then the other only add I would have to that, would probably have a long list of things, would just be speed and time. We talk about the need to develop new varieties faster to meet a variety of market needs. The only way we'll do that is with technology that enables us to move faster. So the faster we have clarity around regulatory guidelines, Jan mentioned, that's how we will do it. Yeah.
But I actually also think that also here from these days of conference and the different discussions, I think even regulatories, it's not like it's set in stone everything they do. So they will be inspired by each other. I think EU we don't know where it's going to land, but we think also EU is trying to take in a sensitive topic in this area, which is the consumer adaptation or view on these things. And they are not science based; they are consumers, and that can be right or wrong. But I think EU is at least trying to tackle how to cater for that opposition or that audience in a different manner that is potentially currently in the UK one, which could be inspiring UK to saying, yes, whatever a sustainability trade is, which however format it will be, but it will help a discussion instead of making hard cliffs towards consumer, because history has learned us that is not a good way to bridge innovation if consumer stands on a cliff and becomes very much industry and consumer. So I think there's an angle there where we hopefully can learn from each other, and regulation will evolve faster when there is a frame than without the frames.
Very well said. Let's talk grassroots just for a little while, because when we are in the big topics of regulatory and policy, it can almost be easy to forget the fact that this is all rooted very much in the soil and with farmers. Nigel, again, I keep picking on you because you are the Brit here. We are relatively early days. So is there discussion amongst farmers at this point? Are you hearing feedback from farmers on this move?
Oh, for sure. And the farming sector, practical farming sector, again, have their financial pressures in their systems, and they're wanting better varieties, faster, reliable performance. They are responding to changing weather conditions, changing production conditions, policies for land use. So faster breeding, faster improvement. We get a lot of very supportive comments from farmers and growers. The UK government has in this whole process, and as usual, you get a consultation process first, and then an impact assessment, and then some regulation. Well, in the consultation process, the farmers are saying, "Well, yes, we need more and better plant breeding," and part of that sustainability driven, part of it's economic driven, part of it's policy driven, but for sure. And now we're in the discussion, and we've got the act, and the secondary legislation is in place, but the guidance is coming relatively quickly, and it's supposed to be in place by the end of November. And again, the farming community are saying, well, what can we have? When can we have it? And of course, yes, there's a whole load of other regulation, which means you register varieties, and it takes you some time and breeding. But I mean, these first products that are coming from, startup companies in particular, are very keenly anticipated.
The other part, of course, of the seed value chain. So we start with farmers, and another key part of the discussion is the consumer end of things. Katie, maybe I can throw it to Katie and Jan. In terms of communicating in order to get public trust in NGT technologies, what is the role of the industry now that the UK is moving forward? What would be your recommendations in terms of next steps?
Yeah, that's a really important question, right? And it really is all about education, but it is a challenge, because what we know to be true is that most general consumers, while they have very strong preferences and in some geographies, where they're putting their dollars, most still don't know that much about our food system and how food is produced. So we are still dealing with that reality. So there's a disconnect between technology and production, and ultimately what arrives in the store or on their plate. But what we have seen, I think what we've learned, especially from early days of GMOs and transgenics, is we have to communicate more. And I think at CIBUS, we've been really focused on doing that, making sure that our technology is clearly explained, it's accessible, not just to consumers, but to growers and down the supply chain, right? But really focusing on explaining what it is, back to, breeding, what is plant breeding? Of course, that's a concept that's not familiar to most consumers, but how does that affect the food they buy? One of the things that's really exciting for consumers is they will have a lot more choice. A lot of the traits that we're working on, including CIBUS quality traits, like high fiber wheat, for example, and other examples, will give consumers more choice, healthier, more nutritious foods. So there is a huge consumer upside to what we're doing. And so not only educating on the safety and what it is and how it fits, but the benefits to the consumer will be really, really key.
And I think Katie is completely right. And I think it's a huge challenge to educate consumers. And we are not government, we are not anything. But I think also that's where we have to embrace that somehow. And that's also why whatever compromise EU lands, there will be an element of something which has to have transparency or some kind of labeling or justify. So at least we don't get in the pitfall of trying to say, well, we stand on science and they're just uneducated. That's we can't go that way. I don't think it is, but I think it's crucial and it's ongoing.
Yeah, maybe I can comment on that as well from the UK experience, is that during this whole process, there have been cross-industry working groups from farmers, breeders, producers, and retailers in the end to also discuss this. And those dialogues have been very important in informing government how to regulate and dealing with topics like, well, should there be endpoint consumer labeling? I mean, that's still a discussion in Europe. And absolutely the whole chain, including retailers, said, well, no, because there's not a safety topic here. There's nothing to put on the label. If somebody in the supply chain wishes to be technology free for any reason, there's sufficient transparency in the seed market and variety market to say, yes, I don't want to use that. So we can give sufficient transparency for segregated supply chains if somebody wants to segregate a supply chain for an economic reason. But don't mislead people into thinking that there's something to be wary about just because that mutation was done one way and another mutation was done another. So that dialogue and stakeholder dialogue and education process is really important. We've taken some first baby steps in the UK of getting that very much in the corporate sector of all of those things rather than directly with consumers, but education about what is plant breeding, why is it, and the fact that it's so hidden to most ordinary citizens. And so when you talk about the science, it all sounds a bit scary. And that education process is absolutely key. And that will rely on the products that come. And when we see non-browning fruit and we see long shelf life and things that people can see and touch and taste, and they go, oh yeah, this is good. And those experiences will be absolutely key in getting comfort with the addition of extra tools in the toolbox.
Excellent answer. I am watching our time ticking down at an alarming rate, so I'm going to try to squeeze in two last short answer questions. The first one being, if this microphone was not going out to a seed sector audience, but was going directly into the ear of policymakers in the EU, what would you say?
I'm a bit biased being a Dane because the Danes hold the presidency right now in EU, but I think there's been so much work done from the various organizations. And I think there is something potentially on the table now where the art of compromise needs to fall in place. So I would really hope that the Danes presidency gets this done. I know it's high on their agenda and they work hard for it.
Perfect. Katie?
I couldn't agree more. I think, the clarity is, number one. Developers need that to have certainty for investment, to have certainty for development. It's an important one. Another one I would add is flexibility. The regulatory process is long, and it's complicated, right? As we've seen with the NGT file and how that's progressed. So building in an amount of flexibility into that system to allow for it to evolve as they learn, as it is implemented, will be extremely important. So that means not having criteria that is so narrow that it can't be interpreted. It means having opportunities for industry to get, let's say, opinions on technology as we see opportunities like this in other markets. So early kind of opinions on regulatory status, so companies can know where the fate of their material is, several years down the line. That flexibility is really important for any regulatory system to remain evergreen and really to support the industry. And I hope that's the direction it will go. And also very optimistic about the Danes getting it done. Yeah.
Nigel?
Well, I think at a risk of saying things I'd already said, speed is really important. The world is moving on. And I think there is a time pressure to enable technology in breeding to actually be competitive with the rest of the world. And so Jan's absolutely right. Some compromises are necessary, but the speed is important. And the second part I would come back to is, dear regulators, do stick to science as much as possible. The principle is it can happen in nature. When you look at what happens in nature, none of our food crops look at all like their wild relatives. Some of that was the influence of human beings. A lot of it was nature. So the idea that only little tiny changes are possible is not the case. So stick to the science, look at the reality, and make sure that it creates that opportunity for innovation, because that will be necessary for food security and sustainable food system for the long term.
And if you could summarize in just a word or two what success looks like in 10 years for science-based innovation in the EU. Katie, can I throw it to you first?
Oh, yeah, that's a big
toughie.
one. Yeah, I would say it's elements of what we've discussed, though. It's the clarity. So a clear path to market that is understood, science-based regulatory requirements that companies of all sizes can meet. So not just the biggest and the ones with the biggest and deepest pockets, but also the small, like universities and small developers as well. And a system that not only functions, but it functions in a timely way so that we're able to move fast. So the technology is a fast way to develop new varieties, but it doesn't matter if you have a regulatory system on the other end, then that takes years, to get through. So the speed on both sides is really important.
Nigel?
Certainty. It really is this lack of vagueness. So you've got clear criteria, you know what you can do, and then you can invest in these developments, because they're not super quick, and they still cost money. They're still a diversion of resources. So making that market clear, certain, this is what I can do, then you'll get more and more investment.
Excellent.
And with 10 years, I think that is suitable time for plant breeders to really launch traits into the market and have them at scale. So I think a small hope would be, regardless of the technology, but that the consumer 10 years out, there are some good cases within EU on something that they understand, being sustainability or less herbicides or drought tolerance that saves a farmer in Spain as something that where the innovation in plants and the breeding shows clearly this was because of innovation, so the consumer can understand that.
Excellent. I very much appreciate all three of you taking time to chat through what is just one piece of a very complex puzzle. Thank you for your time. I wish we had about 3 more hours to keep digging into it.
Thank you. It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.